So Mike's going to come up first and speak to us about our first theme of identity, and then immediately after him, Niv will come up and speak for a few minutes.
Great. An artist called Marina Abramovich did a piece of performance art a few years ago where essentially all she did was she set up a chair and a couple of tables in the middle of the room, and she sat on one side of the table, and you could come and sit on the other chair, and she would just look into your eyes for as long as you wanted. I wonder, if you imagine doing that, how do you think it would make you feel? I came across an article of photographs of people who'd sat with her. Each photo was labelled with how long it had been before they burst into tears. So this is 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 9 minutes, 11 minutes, 12 minutes, 14 minutes, 18 minutes, 28 minutes, 29 minutes, and then 2 hours and 44 minutes. It's really powerful to be seen, isn't it? I wonder if part of what you're seeing in those people and those tears is relief. The relief of not needing to try and get someone's attention. Relief from the exhaustion of trying to be seen, trying to earn the approval and the attention of the people around us. Because here is this woman just looking at you. I think many of us spend our lives, a lot of the time, exhausted by the attempt to earn the approval of the people around us. It might be feeling that we need to live up to the expectations of our families, or it might be trying to make sure we never let our friends down. Or it might just be that we feel we need to keep being enough to get people's attention, to get people to like us. There's a really great song in the film Encanto that's all about that pressure, and it has this haunting line in it, under the surface, I'm pretty sure I'm worthless if I can't be of service. And that's exhausting, right? If our sense of identity, our sense of what we are worth, comes from the approval of others, we will always have to keep fighting to keep that up, to maintain it. It will be exhausting. And I think that's why there's such a massive kind of swing against that in our popular culture. Think of songs like Let It Go or This Is Me. You know, actually, loads of the big songs, the big films, the most popular kind of self-help books, they all have the same basic message. Don't depend on what other people think of you for your identity. Ignore what other people say. Don't look around to find your identity. Look inside. You do you. Just be yourself. But the problem is, that is exhausting too. Because even if we stop trying to earn other people's approval, if we want a sense of identity, if we want a sense of what we are worth, we'll just have to earn our own approval. And I think that a lot of the time that's actually harder. Think about how it would feel if, rather than sitting opposite Marina Abramovich for that long, you had to just sit and look at yourself in a mirror for that long. How would it make you feel? I actually, weird as it is, thought I should probably do that as an experiment for the sake of this talk. So at home I just went and I sat and I just looked at myself in the mirror for a while. Do you want to guess what happened in my head? As much as I didn't want it to, my head just kept on assessing myself, judging myself. Noticing noticing the bits where I hadn't shaved properly, starting to think about how weird freckles are as a concept. Just noticing all of the things that I didn't really like about my face. And this is not about just sort of physical appearance. My point is that the message, you just need to accept yourself just as you are, is a lot easier said than done. We all need a sense of identity. We need a sense of what we're worth. And whether we try to get that from earning the approval of the people around us, or just from earning our own approval, either way, it will be fragile and it will be exhausting. And of course, sitting opposite a stranger in an art gallery is not a long-term solution either. I mean, in some ways, that sense of being seen wasn't actually real for them, because Marina Abramovich doesn't know these people. She doesn't know who they are or what they're like. She doesn't love them. She is just giving them eye contact. It's almost like it sort of simulates the experience of what we actually know that we need. We need to be seen. We need to be fully known as we really are, and we need to be loved. Fully loved and valued. And I want to suggest as we start tonight that when we meet Jesus, we find a source of identity that is not exhausting because we discover that we are fully known and fully loved. I love reading about what happened when people met Jesus in the Gospels and the way that time and time again, he just changes everything for them. I actually have a good friend whose whole life was transformed by just literally reading through the 4 Gospels and looking closely at how Jesus interacted with women. And just seeing how he treated women changed the way she saw herself completely. And I just want to show you a couple of sentences written in a letter by one of the people who met Jesus, just to kind of describe that transformation. So this is Paul, and he writes, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." These are such profound words. They get to the heart of the mystery of Christianity, which is that Jesus actually takes hold of us. He unites us to himself so that it's as if our old self, all of our sin and failure and shame, all of our guilt, all of our selfishness, all of that, it's as if it has been crucified with Jesus when he died for us on the cross. It's been buried with him and it's gone, it's dealt with, it's done. And then he raises us from the dead in his resurrection from the dead so that we're living this whole new life connected with him. And so Paul is saying, now that Jesus has taken hold of me, the old me, the I without Jesus, just doesn't exist anymore. Paul is absolutely not trying to find his identity by looking in the mirror, looking within himself, not at all. Instead, he is sat looking straight at Jesus and seeing Jesus look back at him. He says, "I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Paul says, I live by looking at Jesus. And Jesus looks back at me with the kind of love that would give anything for me. In fact, better than that, the kind of love that has given everything for me. This is the kind of identity and worth that we discover in Jesus because we know with him that we are fully known and fully loved. We are known exactly as we are. You know, Jesus is God. We can't hide anything from him. There is no point, but we don't have to hide anything from him. He knows it all. He sees all of our failures, our flaws, all the things that we're ashamed of that we wouldn't want anybody ever to see. He knows it all. He sees us exactly as we are. He sees that so clearly that he knew he had to die for us to deal with all of that, to bury it. And yet, even though he knows us completely, he loves us utterly. He knew that he had to die for us, but he loved us so much that he was glad to die for us. That is how completely and passionately Jesus loves us. He knows you to the darkest depths, but he loves you to death. And that is an incredible relief. It is so liberating. I remember one particular time in the middle of my degree where I was just I was collapsing. I was kind of burnt out. I think I just exhausted myself trying to kind of prove myself in too many different directions at once. And I reached a point where I just felt empty, and I was kind of doubting everything in my life, and I didn't want to do anything. And I remember one morning waking, the alarm going off, and just the first thought that went through my head was just, please don't make me do this day. But then the second thought that went through my head was, do you know what? If you didn't get out of bed today, if you just disappointed every person who is expecting something from you today, if you were not a good person in any way, if you achieved nothing meaningful, if you just lay here doing nothing all day, do you know what? At the end of the day, God would love you just as passionately as he does right now. And I remember that just washing over me. And I think I almost laughed out loud. And it certainly gave me the strength that I needed to get up and to do the day. It is so liberating because you know that you don't have to impress Jesus. You can't. You don't have to earn his approval. He's given his love to you for free and forever. And that allows you to go out and actually try to love other people and to do things that are worthwhile, but all of that without the pressure of your identity hanging on it. So if you think back to that line from Encanto, when your identity comes from Jesus, it's not, I'm pretty sure I'm worthless if I can't be of service. It's underneath the surface, I am sure that I am worth the Son of God giving his life for me. So how can I be of service? If we stop looking around at other people and we stop trying to look inside to find our sense of identity and worth, if we look at Jesus, we know that we're fully known and we're fully loved, and it means we can relax. I've put a question on the little menus that you might find interesting to discuss later, but for now I'll hand over to Niv, who we're really grateful that he's come to join us. He'll give us our next perspective on an identity that doesn't destroy difference.
Great to be with you all tonight. Let me ask a question you might have been asked before. So, where are you from? It's a question we ask all the time. It's how we place ourselves. It's how we understand one another. It's why we say things like, I just want to know where they're coming from. It's a perfectly natural, reasonable question, and I've always wished I had a simpler answer to give when people ask it. I was born in one country, to parents who came from another, and then I moved to another before arriving here in the UK as a child, thoroughly confused, and obviously different in ways no one could miss, least of all me. What do you do with that? How do you feel about the things that make you different? Maybe if you dare, look around the room right now. See if anything stands out. How do you feel about the things that make you different? It's complicated, right? Because at one level, we want to stand out. But what if the things that make us different aren't just the reason we stand out, but become reasons we end up being left out? Makes me think about one of my favorite sitcoms, Community. Don't know if any of you have seen it. In one of the episodes, they're filming an advert for their community college. And the advert is asking the question, why do I go to Greendale? And one of the characters, Britta Perry, a blonde student, is meant to say, to meet different people, and then turn and hug Troy, her African-American friend. It's a picture of multi-ethnic harmony. Attractive because, as we so often say, diversity is our strength. And yet, for reasons that aren't to do with them, things go wrong. They end up having to film that advert over and over, take after take, until Troy and Britta lose it. And Britta turns and hugs him and says to meet different people, and Troy shouts, "Stop saying I'm different." And that moment captures so much. It captures so much for us as a society and as individuals. As a society, we want our differences to be something we can celebrate. And at the same time, we feel that difference is a threat. Just think about the marches and protests and clashes on our streets in the past week or two. The multicultural ideal I grew up cherishing feels farther than ever in our public life. And that idea that diversity is our strength, can we really believe that, let alone achieve that in 2003? Difference can threaten us as communities. And for us as individuals, it can leave us feeling rootless and, to use a word Mike did earlier, fragile too. Rootless because I think of my wife, who grew up on the Isle of Wight, and the clue's in the name, and how for 27 years in a row she spent Christmas with the same people in the same room. I can't believe that. I've hardly ever had two in a row in the same place. Rootless and fragile because harder than any overt racism I've experienced are the insidious comments that tell me that all of my achievements are really just down to my token status. Any job or opportunity I get is just because they want to be more diverse, and so I'm just filling a quota. And what do you do when you feel rootless and fragile like that? Well, one option is you try to conform. You work as hard as you can to fit in. You do whatever it takes to excel so that you can prove yourself in a way no one can doubt. I've tried that, and it is hard work. And can I tell you, there is a better way. And it all starts with this. What if the things that make us different are not threats, but gifts? What if they're gifts? Standing in front of the elite of Athens, Paul, an early Christian, spoke across cultural and ethnic barriers, and he said this: "From one man God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land." God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Might be a bit wordy, but that's another way to answer the question, where are you from? And it tells us that the things that make us different are not accidents. It tells us that we're not accidents either. And as a result, who we really are is not something we have to construct for ourselves or keep performing for others, which, as we've just heard, only ever leaves us exhausted and insecure. Because how do we know if who we're trying to be is who we're meant to be, or all that we're capable of being? No, instead of that, who we really are is something we receive. Because each one of us was made by the God who delights in difference. And he has placed us where we are in the world and when we are in history for a purpose. Did you see it? There's a beautiful paradox in Paul's writing there, or what he says rather, that God has made each one of us different so that each one can find the same goal. Him can reach out to the God who isn't far from any one of us, the God who loves to be found. And he loves to be found so much that this God stepped into history in Jesus Christ to change the world forever. And I have found that it's as we look at Jesus that we learn how to see our differences as gifts rather than threats. Look at Jesus' life and you'll see he is uniquely capable of drawing together people from all kinds of different backgrounds and bringing them peace with one another and peace with him. He can do that with those who share his Jewish culture and those outside it, men and women, old and young, rich and poor, people across the political spectrum. He offers each one an all-embracing welcome that changes everything. And it changes everything because Jesus comes to bring forgiveness. Forgiveness for all of the ways that we've turned on one another, for all of the ways that we've turned in on ourselves, for all the ways that we've turned against the God who made us. And Jesus offers that forgiving welcome at the cost of his life. Because as one ancient Christian philosopher put it, only on a cross do you die with your arms outstretched. And that welcome he offers changes everything. Changes everything for me as an individual. In his welcome, I find a secure identity. Not that fragile one I have to keep coming up with or keep performing for other people, but one I can rest in. Because as Mike said, I'm known through and through, and not rejected, seen for all my faults and still forgiven, still loved. And as a society, what Jesus offers changes everything as well. Because gathered around Jesus, we can see the nations as members of one delightfully diverse human family, brought together with all those differences, none of them erased. And in fact, the Bible says that is where history is headed, with humanity from every nation, tribe, people, and tongue gathered around Jesus forever. And that matters. It matters because we could ask another question, just as important as the question, where are you from? Where are you going? Where are we going? Growing up, there was a phone company called Orange, and they had an advertising campaign. The future's bright, the future's orange. 2 problems with that. 1, that slogan makes no sense. 2, that company no longer exists. But if I can borrow from them, with Jesus, the future's bright. The future's every colour a human being can be. Because it turns out that in his hands, the things that make us different become the gifts we've always longed for them to be. And Jesus offers us the identity that doesn't erase our difference in order to bring us together, but enables them to shine in all their glory. And that's something that can transform everything for us. If that's where history's headed, if that's what Jesus can accomplish, if human beings can be brought together, people from every nation, tribe, people and tongue, not forced to conform to some ideal that shuts some out, but brought together in all their difference. That gives us what we need to strive today for peace and justice. Take that famous thing Martin Luther King Jr. Once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Is that true? Well, take God out of the picture, and that's just another slogan that makes no sense. Take God out of the picture, and there is no moral universe, just time, matter, and chance, and a heat depth of everything billions of years after we're gone. But Martin Luther King Jr. knew reality isn't really like that. He knew Jesus' all-embracing welcome for himself, and he knew that this is where history is headed. So let me ask you, what would change for you personally? What would change for us as communities if with Jesus, the things that make us different aren't threats, but gifts? If with Jesus, there is forgiveness enough to cover over all the ways we get it wrong, and indeed to make us forgiving people with one another. If with Jesus, there is a glorious future where all the things that make us different get to stand out without being the reason anyone is left out. What would change? Thanks so much for listening to me.
Hello. Please continue eating your dessert if you so wish, and please do pop any questions that you've been thinking about, talking about, onto the Slido, because we're going to have a quick chat now for the last few minutes of our time together. So the first question that has been put up is that sometimes Jesus seems to ask a lot of his followers, and that following demands sacrifice. So how does that fit with having a non-exhausting identity in Jesus? Anyone like to take that?
That's a good question, and I feel like it's about my talk, so maybe I should do that. So I think it's a brilliant question, and I think it comes down to, I was frustrated by having only 10 or slightly more than 10 minutes to talk about such a massive thing, but I tried to say at the end a little bit about it doesn't mean that, on that morning where I didn't want to get out of bed, realizing that God would love me just as deeply if I didn't stop me from doing that. It actually gave me the strength to go and do the day. And the difference is, the kind of fundamental difference is that we are called to go and follow Jesus and try and be like him and try and love people sacrificially like he loved people, to try to glorify and honor God the way that he did. We are called to this amazing, incredibly kind of high bar of what it is to be human. But it's not that we have to it's not that we're trying to do that in order to be loved and known and accepted and valued. It's that God does that for us first in Jesus. He comes out to us in all of our mess and failure and selfishness, accepts us, loves us, and then, like I was talking about from that bit, it's like our old self dies with him. He raises us to this new life connected to him and sends us out, with him to go and live this new, beautiful life. And so it's not this kind of exhausting trying to live up to a standard. It's like being kind of catapulted out with him into a new life. And actually, the more you get to know Jesus and the more you spend time with him, the more that's the life you want to live. It's not like, oh my goodness, I still have to, try and ... It's like, I really want to be more like this. Help me today, Jesus, by your strength, not mine, to be more like this. So it doesn't feel exhausting. It feels like having a friend and a strength to be the people that we were actually made to be.
Feel free to bounce off ideas, but we've got a few questions in here, so I'll kick off another. One that's been voted up is a quote that if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Is identity dependent on being perceived? So if someone were to never interact with anyone, for example, do they have an identity?
It's a very philosophical question, and can I start us off and then hand over to someone else who has other thoughts? Other than I studied languages, and I moved around 3 different places in basically like 6 months of my year abroad. And one of the things I found really helpful was every time I moved into a new place and I was trying to speak in another language, didn't feel very me. And say I was only there for like a month or 3 months or whatever, I found it like when I came away and moved away from that place, I felt like I had learned something about myself because bits of me had been brought out in relationship with other people. And maybe even only in 3 weeks or 3 months, I had begun to form a relationship, and that revealed something about who I was. And so I think the perception question is really important. I think being in a community, in a family, like draws different bits of us out. We are sometimes like a version of ourselves that we are only ever really that version when we're with someone else. And I think that's the sad thing about friendships that end or like kind of death that ends relationships, because we don't get to access that part of ourselves. But I also really fundamentally believe that we have meaning because we are made in God's image and loved by him. And so on the one hand, I want to say that is just concrete. And also maybe we're never not in relationship because we're always in relationship with him. So those are some thoughts. Anyone else got them?
Well, no, I think that in that last thing kind of, I think, is philosophically makes sense to me as the answer to that question. It feels difficult because you think if somebody did live in total isolation from other people, would that, they would not be remembered, they wouldn't have had any impact on any other lives. Lots of the things we would use to measure what makes a life count wouldn't be the case, but would they still matter? Would they still have an identity? Yes. And I think that the reason that isn't actually a kind of logical conflict, that it does make sense, is that all of us are always in relationship with the God who made us. He always sees us. And so there is no ultimate isolation for us in this world. I won't try and ramble more philosophically than that.
Thank you. We've got a question, I'll just read it as it is, that says, when we're in the whirlwind of a disaster, the untold suffering differentiates no one. It's difficult to feel God's love. How can we keep our faith?
Great question. Thank you so much. And I don't want to speak for anyone else on the stage, but I imagine that's something we all have experienced at different times and in different ways. So thank you so much. I think there are so many arguments you can make about how the experience of suffering I undergo fits in the great jigsaw of everything with the existence of God. And you know what? It's interesting to have those conversations. But the thing that has made a real difference for me is, and I think we've covered a lot tonight in all of the talks, not so much mine, I don't think, but is to know that Jesus has been there. That when the suffering lands on you, that is not an alien experience to God. In fact, let's take that a bit further. When Jesus dies on the cross, one of the things he says, quoting the Old Testament scriptures, is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, this is remarkable because it tells us that if you ever feel distant from God, God has been there too. If you like, Jesus has, to use the technical term, sanctified even the experience of God-forsakenness, so that to those who know him, even when he feels utterly absent, he is there. And that is the thing that makes the difference for me. I think that the wording in question is something like it's difficult to experience that. Is that right? But that's the point. On the cross, as he dies, Jesus experiences the lack of experience with God that perhaps we crave in those moments. And if that's true, then that actually means there really is nowhere I can go and nothing I can experience that would separate me from the love of God that is in Christ. And if that's true, then I've got something, even when it feels like I have nothing. Much we could expand on there, I suppose.
Thanks. Are there other questions, or should we keep talking about them?
I think there's time for either of you to comment if you've got more you'd like to say.
I mean, that was just great. I'm not sure. I guess there was a word in the question about it doesn't feel like it differentiates. And I think that's part of the tragedy, isn't it? It sometimes just feels so random. And I guess I don't have much to add to what Niv says other than to just acknowledge that is true. That is often the experience. But to come back to what I found really powerful that Zana was talking about with the fact that Jesus is resurrected in this glorious renewed body with the wounds of his experience on the cross still there, but part of his beauty and his glory that will last forever. And I think it's a hugely powerful part of the hope that we have in Jesus, that no part of our suffering will ever be kind of forgotten, will ever turn out to have been meaningless to God. It will all become, he will take all of it and make it part of the glory that we are forever with him. So looking back from there, it will never feel like it was random and meaningless and futile.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask from the floor? That's fine. I'd give you the opportunity. We've got one more question about what hope can we have for people who maybe lose their sense of identity or are disabled and don't have the capacity to become a Christian?
Again, I feel like I have really very introductory thoughts to this question because it's big and it's hard. Other than to say, I'm really glad that God is much bigger than I am and knows and sees more clearly than I do and understands people in a way that I can't judge, I can't work out. And yet he sees us in the innermost parts and he knows. And I think I just trust that he's the one who sees all things and therefore knows someone, even if they've never expressed out loud something while they've been able to kind of, articulate a profession of faith or a kind of a sense of what they believe in. He sees, he knows their thoughts, and I trust him to do that. What was the question? I had some wording about kind of losing a sense of identity. One of the things, one of the things that I would have loved to have talked about more is this is a slight separate point to the question, but how much of our identity is just like not in the way we think, but in just like having a body, being embodied. I get into my mum's hospital bed with her, and I basically lie on her, and she looks very uncomfortable. But because I feel like one of the things about often is that if you're in a wheelchair, you can't be hugged in the same way. And being a body matters as well as being a brain. And so I just think maybe another thing I'd want to say is that as we kind of lose a sense of, yes, being able to think, and if we pride ourselves on our intellectual achievements, that hurts. But if you've got a body you can hug, like hug the body and like hold the person and know that being embodied really matters for your identity. Like, you haven't lost yourself just if you can't think anymore. My mum is still very much alive, and there's so much to hold on to. So that is not the question, but a point I wanted to make. Sorry about that.
Thanks again for that question. And, just extending some of the things Susanna was saying there, it's really interesting that when Jesus is challenged to produce an example of greatness, he doesn't choose a sort of thrusting, assertive, accomplished person. He chooses a little child. On another occasion, he takes a literal infant in his hands, in his arms, and says, the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. What's he doing in a moment like that? He's trying to help us when we ask questions like that one, good questions like that one, to realize that with him, the condition for Christianity is not kind of the stuff I'm capable of, but my dependence, my capacity to depend on him. I've got a couple of daughters. The youngest is 1.5, so she's not really a baby anymore. She's a toddler, toddling around. But I just remember with both of them the utter need that they presented, and at that point, nothing else. And you kind of think, well, what is this little one? In some ways, their identity is a bit of a mystery when you're first holding them straight out of the womb. And then you get to know it. Boy, you get to know what they're like as the months go by. And I think that mystery of personhood, it can deceive us into thinking that there's a point at which you arrive and then you're really you, and that's the point at which God will think, yeah, I'll have you now. But by starting with the very smallest, what Jesus is actually saying, no, he's the one who comes before that moment where you think you know who you are. And as Anna said so beautifully, even after the moment where you stop, that's a God worth knowing, the one who knows you.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have. So I'm going to ask again if anyone would like to bounce off any of these ideas or ask a particular question. In which case, I will thank our speakers again. I've been really moved and thought-provoked, if that's a word. So thank you. I'm sure I don't speak just for myself. There will be tea and coffee coming to you where you sit before we finish. So even though this is the last you'll hear from us at the front, it's not the very end. We won't push you out the door just yet. And also coming around to you are little bags. And in here, there's a few things I'm going to tell you about. First, there's a little chocolate that's just slipped out. That's for you. There is a blue flyer. There's a blue flyer that inside talks about some of the events we're having around Christmas at Eden, which I'm excited for Christmas. There are things in here for families with little kids. There are traditional carol services, more contemporary services, all throughout December. And you are welcome to come to any of these. Some are at Eden, some are elsewhere. That's in your bag. There's also a little yellow slip that says 321. And this links you to an online course that will give you little 10-minute videos that just expand on a lot of the things you would have heard touched on this evening. They're really accessible and engaging. They're about 10 or 12 minutes. So if you'd like to just listen to a sound bite as you wash up, or you'd like to bring the person that you came with tonight and say, let's keep this going and think about it more. This will be a really great discussion starter, just like we've had this evening, and they have discussion questions on there. So that's the website, 321course.com. That's this small yellow one. But if you'd like to go straight to one of the biographical sources of Jesus' life, we've got a small paper here that's Luke's Gospel, and that's a narrative of Jesus' life straight from people who knew him, and you can go and look at that alone if you like, or with the person who brought you. So these will come round, as will tea and coffee. So enjoy the rest of your evening. It's been great.